Well, I wanted to do a video today again, and I've been thinking about this topic for some time. In fact, a long time, but focusing in on an idea that I got from remembering Saint Teresa of Ávila. We're living in two planets, really. Maybe, probably even in the church, which people speak of a soft schism or a silent schism. Many people, hate the Pope. In prior times, the same kind of people that like authoritarian rule, etc., would have talked just about the Pope and Mary. Congar said they should be talking about Jesus and the gospel. The Pope at the time, Pius XII, had silenced Yves Congar, who later was um, called as an expert at Vatican II. And I was reading a very interesting Yves Congar, the great Dominican theologian whom I met in Paris, was a seminarian, not a Dominican, until he heard a man, a Dominican called Reginald Garrigou Lagrange, preach or speak, and he decided to become a Dominican. Garrigou Lagrange had been a medical student who had a conversion. He became very conservative, even though he attended the great Dominican school Les Sols Choix. To give you an idea of the Dominican experience that I was part of, having been a Dominican friar with simple vows, temporary vows for several years, and still considering myself to have a Dominican soul. Uh, the student of Garrigou Lagrange was Marie-Dominique Chenu, who wrote a book on Les Choix, this great Dominican theology school that provided probably the single largest contingent from one place to Vatican II. And when Chenu wrote this book on this school of theology, Les Choix, which I read, Garrigou Lagrange petitioned to put this book on the index of prohibited books. So you see how we can have division. Garrigou Lagrange famously directed the doctoral dissertation of John Paul II on St. John of the Cross. I've heard it's not very good. By that time, in I guess the 40s or 50s, probably the 50s, Garrigou Lagrange was a very retrograde, too conservative man who didn't keep up even with his own order. I think he's the darling of very conservative people. But interesting, these connections. Um, and the motto of the Dominicans is Veritas, as I have said before, the truth. And I was already, I think, pre-wired and disposed to delve into that tradition of seeking the truth. Later at Harvard, they have the same motto, Veritas, the truth, which today people think the truth is something you can make up. As an American, you have the right to your own facts and your own truth, whereas the search for truth requires a lot of work, and we're going to look at that in a second. The Dominican motto from Aquinas in the brief form is contemplari et contemplata ali stradere, to contemplate and to bring to others what has been contemplated. Contemplata, the things that were pondered, especially in the Sacra Pagina, the sacred page, which for Aquinas was scripture, and I think you could include the fathers and even theology. And so this tradition uh, of fides et ratio, faith and reason, is what John Paul, Wojtyla at the time, the future John Paul II, learned from Garrigou-Lagrange. Interestingly enough, paradoxically, because Garrigou, his reason, I think, lagged behind. Certainly that of his pupil Chenu, who was an expert at the council, and certainly that behind that of the school that he had been to, that he later condemned because he was not happy with the historical method and other advances that had been made in theology from his day. He had had a conversion and he stuck to some narrower uh, points of view and did not understand his own Dominican brethren shining now in Vatican II. He died having the council having started. But I wanted to go into something very interesting, which is what Saint Teresa of Avila, I prefer to call her Teresa of Jesus, but Avila is what makes it clear she's not the little flower of Lisieux who is also a doctor of the church. Teresa loved books. She had Jewish ancestry. I could talk a lot about that. I can't digress too much. And when she started getting spiritual direction and praying, she ran into mistaken and ignorant advisors who said that her prayer was of the devil. It was a novelty, talking about the prayer of quietud, of calm, quietness, etc. It's like the quietists or pietists or other heresies like that in Spain was very concerned to keep out the Protestant revolution, the Lutherans, etc., under Philip II, etc., in 16th century Spain. And it was not until she ran into especially Dominicans and the newly founded Jesuits that she realized that what she was convinced about as to the divine origin of her prayer and mystical path that she had embarked on after many years of laxitude and even trial and error and not finding her way, with these Dominicans and Jesuits who were learned, she would call them letrados, she had great confidence. And as opposed to more pious but very ignorant advisors who couldn't understand what she was doing and who advised her in a totally wrong manner. You know that the Inquisition was interested in her and she had to deliver her life over to the Inquisition for a time. And finally, she was totally absolved, as was Ignatius Loyola, pretty much with some conditions. The Inquisition got him too, the same century. And then, of course, she became a doctor of the church, especially because of her mystical theology. Well, what she says is that the master or the spiritual director should be a person who's aware, who should have good understanding and experience. If he has letters, in other words, if he's learned, educated, well educated, it's a great thing. But if you can't get all three things together, the first two are important because they can seek out the learned to consult with them in case of need. She says that in the beginnings, if they don't have prayer, these nuns, letters avail little. They're of little use. I don't say that they should not have dealings with educated men or, letrados, these learned men, because a spirit that has not begun in truth, I'd rather that that person didn't even pray, she says, because she's gonna be led astray. She's gonna think she's very holy and she's doesn't have the information necessary. She goes, es gran cosa letras. Letters are a great thing because these teach us, we teach us who know little and give us great light. And having come to the truth of sacred scriptures, we do what we should, because silly devotions, God free us from them. She continues, I'm going to skip a little bit. This is from the book of her life, chapter 13. In section 18, she says, and although for this prayer life, it seems that letters are not necessary, my opinion has always been and will be that any Christian should try to have dealings with those who have good letters, lots of learning, if he can. And the more, the better. And those who are on the path of prayer have greater need of this. And the more spiritual they are, the more they have this need. And let that person not deceive herself by saying that letters without prayer are not for those who pray. I have dealt with many because from some years to now, I have sought it because of greater need, and I have always been a friend of the cultured, educated directors. And although some don't have experience, they're not into the prayer that much, they don't despise the Spirit, nor do they ignore it. Because in the sacred scripture with which they are involved, they are students of the scriptures, they always find truths, the truths of the good Spirit. I hold that a person of prayer should have dealings with cultured people if she doesn't want to be deceived. And the devil will not deceive her with illusions, because I think they fear greatly humble letters and virtuous letters. And they know, the demons know that they will be discovered and will come out losing, etc. I have said this because there are opinions that cultured people are not fit for people of prayer if they don't have the Spirit. I already said that it's necessary to have a spiritual director, but if he is not a man of letters, this is very inconvenient, very unsuitable, and it will be a great help to deal with them if they are virtuous. Even if they don't have Spirit, they will be of use to me, and God will let them understand what they should teach. And He will even make them spiritual so that He can be of benefit to us. And I don't say this without having tried it first. And it has happened to me already with more than 2 of them. And she goes on to say that these men of letters have worked very hard. They have attained to the truth that we ignorant people ignore. And I am shocked sometimes by the men of letters, especially the religious ones, the ones who are in religious orders, how much work they have had to devote that I, without doing any work, just by asking, have benefited from. And wow, to think that there are people that don't want to take advantage of this. May God forbid it. I see them, very, devoted to their work uh, of studying, etc., which the Dominicans, by obligation and tradition, have to study. And so this is interesting that Teresa of Jesus uh, basically says that a holy or very pious director who is ignorant, not learned, can lead and did lead her astray. Whereas a director with education and letters, even though he may not practice exactly what he preaches, he's going to be loath to say things that lead somebody astray. And he may even become more spiritual. And so I've always remembered this from Teresa of Avila, having been a Discalced Carmelite also for several years, that the ideal director is holy and learned. But if he can't be both, she would prefer the learned one to the holy one who may not know what he's talking about. Simple as that. And so I think that the main difference between the two planets is is the lack of thinking and the lack of reason in one planet. This cartoon that appeared, shared by a friend of mine, it's got the credit there. I'm not sure uh, how to interpret the credit of the person who did this cartoon. The same people that might say they're pro-life are all involved in the enmeshed in this, you know, right-wing brainwashing. I think Fox Network was created specifically by Roger Ailes for that purpose, to addict a certain kind of individual. They're less educated, they're angrier, more befuddled, bewildered, and they brainwash them into this kind of stuff where gun control has become an issue where you have two planets regarding it. And we have mass shootings upon mass shootings by people who, when it comes to abortion, they say that makes them pro-life. Whereas pro-life means pro-life in its totality, not just passing a law to criminalize abortion, which I spoke about in another video. And I believe it's all due to the use of reason that we can escape these traps. I was, thinking about, I forgot what I was going to say. The the um, the in my biblical studies, for example, as I've said, I'm reading the Jewish Study Bible, 2014 edition. All Jewish scholars. I've been studying the Bible for 50 years basically, and we're on the same page. A lot of these Jewish scholars have actually studied with Gentile professors, as I have. I haven't had one Jewish professor for Bible ever. I've listened to many of them, but not having taken courses with them. I took one course by a rabbi on the 13 principles of Maimonides. What I'm saying is that if you use your reason, we can agree on many, many things, and on the things we disagree on, we approach it scientifically, rationally, with even with faith and reason. Whereas if you're irrational, there's no discussing with you. That's why I have ceased to discuss with people who make up stuff, whom I know from intimate relations with, in the sense of frequent meetings and such, that they prefer to fantasize. They prefer to make up their reality. I've seen this close up. I've done all kinds of things in the church, and I've also been very much part of the charismatic movement. Not as a real charismatic, but since I had friends that were in it, I've gone to many, many charismatic events with thousands of people. I've heard many charismatics, etc. They go for emotion. They go for inducing an exalted status state. They prefer the supernatural explanation to the scientific or natural one, which is precisely what the primitive societies did. So that even in the New Testament, everything is an unclean spirit. Well, maybe it's epilepsy now, or mental illness, or something else. But I know people that prefer to rely on what they dreamt than on maybe psychological principles. They prefer the magical thinking solution to the hard work. I know people that refuse to take courses lest they be contaminated with the same learning that Teresa of Ávila extols so much. And so I've been to these charismatic meetings, and they like to prophesy. They want to be like the Pauline communities, thinking that they are going to speak in tongues and prophesy. And you'd have to really discern those spirits to see whether it's true or it's a fantasy. I was with the hermits in Italy 4 months in 2013, and the reason I left is that I realized they didn't know what the heck to do. They needed guidance, even though they had a priest in charge, or the head of along with a woman. So they turned to this ex-Catholic, charismatic Italian. I actually went to an Italian charismatic meeting, a super hot, hall, not Catholic, Protestant. And when they came to pray to me, not the first time, they try to knock you down so that you are baptized in the Spirit, and you have this, and if you were willing and susceptible to that, you would drop dead, or you would drop down and think you were born again in the Lord, and blah blah blah. And when they saw that I wasn't dropping down, he kept saying, unction, more unction, unzione, unzione, you know. And I said to myself, if these hermits go to this guy for guidance, I'm leaving, because these are the blind leading the blind. And so I've learned all those lessons from close up in the church, and as a student of psychology, and as somebody who is very suspicious of thinking that flatters you or makes you feel good. People are desperate for that. They want to feel affirmed and good because they feel humiliated, left behind, all this stuff. And it's good to give encouragement, but it's not good to lie to people. I've had a long life. I've had periods where I have had to be ruthlessly honest with myself, ruthlessly explore myself, my mind, my life, and come out with very harsh judgments sometimes, that I prefer to hear the truth from a doctor than a lie. I prefer to hear the truth from a friend than some flattering illusion that's not true. The truth will set us free. It may hurt, just like an operation hurts. But if it's required, you have to undergo it. You can't deny you have a disease. And that is what often happens with all these emotions. People escape into pseudo holiness, and become anti-intellectual. They distrust, experts. Even Paul was accused of too much learning has made you mad, or something like that. But Teresa of Avila, who had this background of Judaism, they say that in Spain, it's the 16th century, when they were, uh, persecuting Jews and Muslims, you could prove you weren't Jewish by showing that you were illiterate. And many Spaniards were proud to be illiterate because that meant they weren't Jewish. Very strange. Of course, the church in the Middle Ages was very superstitious and thought the Jews needed, baby blood or something, for the Passover or whatever. Incredibly ignorant, incredibly ignorant. Unlike, for example, this Jewish woman who became a Carmelite, Edith Stein, who went to this place, Boiron, a Benedictine abbey, with a very progressive abbot, Balzer, I think his name was, who was, shushed out under the Nazis. He wasn't Jewish. He was the Benedictine abbot. And she thought that this place was the lobby of heaven, the sort of like the atrium or the antechamber. It says here in this French translation of heaven. She loved being in this very important abbey with lots of learning. Of course, she was a philosopher. Entered the Carmelites and was allowed to continue writing and even some philosophical studies. St. Dominic went to universities and cities, University of Paris and other places, Bologna, probably the oldest university. And he was a man of letters, and the Dominicans and the Jesuits were the advisors of Teresa of Ávila. Ignatius began teaching catechism. He was not a man of letters. He started very late his studies, and I think he was 26, starting with little schoolboys to learn some Latin. Then went to Paris and met Francis Xavier and others, and took courses here and there, but not systematically. But his sons, the Jesuits, he sent them to learn as much as they could in all fields, science and Oriental languages and all kinds of things. Faith and reason. And if you really follow reason, we'll be on the same page. I've seen this time and again. Even an atheist. I'm reading a very interesting book on Judaisms, plural, and their messiahs, plural. And I'm reading this man called Burton Mack, whom I discovered more than 20 years ago when I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the Gospel of Mark. He has a book called A Myth of Innocence. And at the time I said he's way far out. He's a non-believer. He's saying all these things. 20 years later, I'm reading this book that he wrote. He wrote this chapter on the book of wisdom, I think it is. And he's discussing the righteous one in the book of wisdom, the wisdom of Solomon. And what he's saying, I, having studied this book and having had to study the book to some extent, the truth is the truth. Even though I know from other contexts that he comes from kind of a far out place. He taught at Claremont. He died some years ago, not many. When you start reading what he's written on texts like this one of the Book of Wisdom, you see that it matches what you have studied, even though you were not in that school or influenced by that. It's just from your own studies. I've studied in many different places. I've studied in the seminary of Madrid, very conservative. I studied in the Gregorian. I had very conservative Bible teachers. I studied at Harvard Divinity School, and I had Bultmanians who were, liberal people. But the two planets, you can maybe classify them as conservative and progressive. And the conservative, again, I would think of this Garrigou-Lagrange again. He had a conversion, left the study of medicine, but then did not grow with the school that he had gone to with the Dominicans, Les Solchois. And his students passed him by, and he became uh, stale and obsolete. He hated a man, or really disliked a co-religionary, another Dominican with a similar name, Mary Joseph, not Garrigou-Lagrange, but Mary Joseph Lagrange, about whom I've spoken many times in these videos, if you've seen some of them. Lagrange, Mary Joseph Lagrange, from the province of Toulouse in the south of France, went to Spain because of the suppression of the orders in France, etc. Went to Salamanca, studied solid theology, as I believe I did in Mexico, precisely with some students of Les Solchois. So I've had, professors who were graduates of Les Solchois, Miguel Concha for one. And having learned solid theology in Salamanca, famous university, especially in the 16th century, Francisco Vitoria and many, many others, Luis Granada, all kinds of people, he became fascinated with biblical studies and went to study with the Protestants in Berlin and other places. Started writing on the Old Testament. I've said this many times. And with the modernist crisis and Pius X, etc., Saint Pius X, he was prohibited from teaching and writing on the Old Testament. He switched to the New Testament, produced huge volumes on all the Gospels, and then the Gospel of Jesus Christ and many other things. Then he was prohibited from teaching the New Testament. So he died under a cloud of doubt as to his orthodoxy in 1938. Obedient, submissive, not like maybe Hans Kuhn or somebody. And then 5 years later, the right-wingers, the retrogrades, the conservatives, made their position so stupid in the world in the 1940s that Pope Pius XII, no liberal, but learned, there you go, published Divino Afflante Spiritu, an encyclical basically legitimizing all of Lagrange's biblical positions. So 5 years after the death of Lagrange, he's legitimated implicitly, 1943. Fast forward 50 years, 1993, another encyclical, maybe it's an instruction on the interpretation of the Bible in the Church, Pontifical Biblical Commission, presented by Cardinal Ratzinger to John Paul II, rehabilitates Mary Joseph Lagrange, greatly suspected and attacked by Garrigou-Lagrange. This document of the interpretation of the Bible in the church, 1993, my professor, later Cardinal Vanois, said we must rehabilitate Lagrange by name, not implicitly. And what they came up with is, even though they didn't get the encouragement they now, receive, men like Lagrange, and they place them with Origen and Jerome, if I recall correctly. Total rehabilitation. Then you take the next step. The next step is his process of beatification, I understand, is proceeding. Take Congar. I read his diary in the 1940s, silenced, prohibited from teaching. Wakes up one morning, reads La Croix, French newspaper. He learns he's an expert at Vatican II. So from reprobate, silenced, now he's an expert. Then you fast forward, John Paul II makes him a cardinal. And that's what learning enables you to know. If you don't know any of this stuff, you think it's all one monolith. And if you hold on to it with like an ostrich, with your head in the sand, you're going to be holy. That is not the tradition of the Catholic Church. And I've read the Council Diaries, 2 volumes in French by Congar. And you see the inner workings of all the intrigues and things that happen to people that seek the truth by others who are scheming for power, not seeking the truth. You have to be able to discern this. In this page from Burton Mack in this book, Judaisms and Their Messiahs, or Its Messiahs, he talks about this righteous one in the book of wisdom, who has been likened very much to Jesus. He's attacked by the wicked, who will put him to the test of an ignominious or a terrible death. The righteous one is pious, gentle. If you're not gentle, blameless. He finds himself in straits that threaten his destiny as one who is to rule. That's the kind of like the paradox. Jesus was king of the Jews, but he's not in circumstances that would validate that humanly. He's got a crown of thorns and he's mocked with a stick, and they put a stick in his hand and dress him in purple. He knows that he is chosen and therefore expects a reversal of the circumstances. But it is a mark of his piety that he takes no action except to pray, keep the law, appeal to the covenants, and affirm his special status as a servant, pais, or son, huios, of God. Theou. It's a Greek book. In this circumstance, he is rescued by means of an active intervention of God's creative powers and raised to the position of rulership. Reminiscences of the functions of prophet, priest, and warrior are used to tell the story, but it is his capacity as judge over and against his erstwhile former enemies and his function as righteous and wise ruler over the nations that are highlighted. So when you study, even when you study philosophy, I'm reading Seneca, you're on the same page. You don't have to impose a religious belief on anyone. To seek the truth and to have goodwill is enough for the unity we require. I heard a truncated version, or at least not the verses that made Congar want ecumenism. May they be one as we are one. That's how the world will believe when they see our unity. And I believe that the unity in the church requires faith and reason. Pope John the 23rd appealed to all men of goodwill, pacem in terris. And so, to conclude, as a Dominican at heart, the truth and primary sources as a Harvard graduate, really truth seeking, which is hard work, as Teresa of Ávila recognized and was grateful for. All she had to do was ask. She didn't read. She didn't go to Salamanca and study, you know, the Summa Theologica or something, you know. And that's why we should be disciples, meaning people who learn. And few of us should be teachers, because we will have a harsher judgment. That's what St. James says. We all fall many times. But today, Umberto Eco, the great Italian literary critic and a semanticist and all kinds of other stuff like that, semiologist, whatever, he talked about the internet. Any idiot can publish on the internet, and other idiots can't tell if they're reading an idiot or a smart guy. You know, idiots think alike, great minds think alike. Like finds like. And so, if we use our reason, and it could be as simple as what Teresa of Ávila did, listen to those who know. The ones who don't know cause a lot of harm. You can test. When I taught in the seminary for 14 years, I would my position was always, don't take my word for it. Look at what I have based what I am saying on. You have access to the same text. It might take you a long time to figure out what took me a long time to figure out. Of course, that's changed. I was thinking, I went to Mexico at the age of 20. I had 2 years of college. I was an honor roll student, very bright and all this kind of stuff. When I went to the Jesuit University Iberoamericana to study theology, I was in the sponge mode. I was there to learn. It didn't cross my mind to question any professor until I knew enough to begin to do that. Fast forward 30 years later almost, I was in Norbert Loefing's class on Deuteronomy at the Pontifical Biblical Institute, the theology of the wilderness in Deuteronomy, by the world's greatest expert, in my opinion, on Deuteronomy, at least at the time, 20 years ago, Norbert Loefing, Jesuit. He was humble enough to say, well, it wasn't even true. He says, I observe you in class, and I see when you have doubts about what I'm saying. And I said, not really. I mean, I said to myself, basically, no, I did have a lot of doubts about what you were saying. I recognized you had mastered the material so well. I mean, forget about it. I mean, really mastered it. I mean, Loefing defended his dissertation in Vatican II, and cardinals and bishops had heard of him, and they attended. So when I heard him in 1998, that beautiful spring, I guess, as an auditor, I was learning, and I was 45 years old, because I had the capacity to know when somebody knew what they were talking about and when they didn't. But when I was in Mexico at 20, 21, 22, 23, and then in Catholic University of America, I was a philosophy student in the Basilian Scholar program, etc., learning about Plato and learning about metaphysics with Father Whipple and all this. I wasn't there like a punk criticizing people because as a punk, I had gone on the internet. There was no internet, but I went on the internet and I found some real wild people who brainwashed me, and now I'm judging everybody, like Umberto Eco said, idiots can now do on the internet. Before, to publish a book, you needed to have a very good book, or else nobody would waste the paper or the press to publish you. So there was a screening process going on. Today, many people don't read any books. They prefer to go online and find their own little bubble. I have people that tell me when I look up a medical issue, they say to me, "Would you go to WebMD or something like that?" I go, "Man, I Google the issue, then I read several articles, maybe even progressing to medical journal articles, and I make up an opinion as to the facts. I don't say I only go to either WebMD, maybe a very good source, I don't know, but I don't go to one source because I have the capacity to judge. And when I do Wikipedia, some people don't like, if I see the footnotes, the documentation, a friend of mine said, I'm reading so and so, I'm not going to mention the name, on Jesus, and I said, I didn't say it like that, but I basically said that's crap. And of course, he was very offended, because who wouldn't be offended? I didn't say that, but if you question what an intelligent person has chosen outside his field completely, and he's very impressed by it because these are bestsellers. And then I asked him a very simple question, which pissed him off even more. Tell me about his bibliography. Because nobody writes a book on the historical Jesus without a bibliography. Pope Benedict had bibliography. Bibliography tells the intelligent reader what this guy is referring to, what he's studying, what he's basing himself on. Some people don't even know what bibliography is, but then he cites 3 books from a bibliography from the 1950s or something. I said, this is like decoration. This is not substance. This is like a little cherry on your sundae, but it's not a healthy, meal. And so, again, to conclude, faith and reason. Faith requires prayer, humility, piety, gentleness, striving to be blameless. The New Testament says that before the world shine as stars, be blameless, etc. The opposite of this thing, where you can't decide whether you should have any gun control, army rifles, or protect the children because of the Second Amendment or some other. That, to me, that's as obvious to me as if you discuss what kind of truth the Bible contains. I would begin with Genesis 1. If you take literally that God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th, you don't know anything about the priestly writer or the holiness school or anything about the composition of Genesis 1. You are at a preschool level. And you can grab the Jewish Study Bible, you can grab any Bible except fundamentalist Bibles. And you'll see that reasonable people are in agreement because they have done the heavy lifting, the heavy spade work, groundwork, etc. And I've experienced that all my life, and I will go to the grave fighting for the truth. It's one of the few virtues I think I have. I prefer truth to lie, even when it seems to offend me or be against me. It's going to be for me in the long run. It'll set me free. And with those words, I think I've said enough. I felt something of an obligation to speak about this.